Well, welcome everyone to the African American Genealogy Society of Fort Wayne and our third Saturday workshops. The topic for this day is talking about research tools and tips for cemeteries, tombstones, and funeral homes. Our agenda today will cover a couple things: cemetery research and records, tombstone research and records, and funeral home history and records, because the history of funeral homes is a very interesting topic here. First was going to be cemetery research here. And I want to share with you a couple of ideas why cemeteries and graves are lost. Again, as we try to focus on trying to find cemeteries, these are some of the reasons they're lost: lack of care, vandalism, falling off the deed. Again, someone has actually lost the deed. The location is not recorded. Records are not available. There are no grave markers. I have that on one of my family members. A grave marker has deteriorated, and time and nature has taken its course. A key question is figuring out which cemetery our relatives are in or when they died. We're talking about death records. Well, the first place to look are family records. Family Bibles may give you some indication. Other family literature may give you information. Cemetery readings, which I'll talk about in previous readings, can give you some insights. Death certificates, autopsy reports, and others can also give you, and medical records can also give you some insights. Another area of interest are mortality schedules, and there are only a few of those, but two others here are funeral records and church records. Again, if you know who the funeral director is or funeral home is, or where the church funeral was held, it may give you some insights. And the last are obituaries and death returns. Now, this is an example of a death record. It just talks about the person, people who passed away, their sex, again, their color, age of death, date of death, place of death, and in either, for example, a town or community. Again, the book that it's located in and the page number that it's on. Now, for cemetery record, again, this is the Salem Cemetery in Union County, Indiana. Again, it talks about the person when they were born and died. Again, and in some cases, who they're related to. So again, this is the insight of what a cemetery record may look like. Now, cemetery reading. We're talking about the original records are usually kept by the cemetery itself, but a key thing for all of us here are libraries and historical societies often have indexes. You can also find information on websites like Find a Grave and Billion Graves. And the last one, of course, is as you look at it, is online cemetery indexes. Now, one of the key things, again, in terms of trying to find a cemetery, again, and this is a death certificate, and this is for my grandfather, Dolan Yates. Again, what it talks about who his wife is, where he lived, what he died from, again, where he worked, place of death, place of birth. It doesn't list his family members, his mother, father, because we don't know who that is, but it does list Mount Hope Cemetery. And again, that's where he is buried with my grandmother, Irene Yates. And again, his date of death is March 15th, 1944. So he died 2 years after I was born. Now, this is one that's a little bit older. Then this is George W. Brothers, who came in from Canada. Again, his date of death was November 19th, 1932. His wife, Ms. Melissa Johnson. So again, it also gives his date of death and factors that contributed to his death. Again, he had chronic enterocolitis in 1902. And again, he had another problem in 1930 that contributed to his death in 1932. This one gives his place of birth, Granville, Nova Scotia. So again, that part of my family was born in Nova Scotia. His father's name and his mother's name. And again, it's signed. And he is actually buried down at Oaks Bluff. Apologize, this one's hard to see, and I apologize, I'm going to skip over it. But this one was from my grandmother, and this was Irene Burgess Yates. She was born in the District of Columbia, married my grandfather, moved to Boston, gave birth to my mother, and died 7 days later. But this is the death record from District of Columbia, because she was shipped back to be buried in the District of Columbia. Now, this is an example. Again, you may never get an original record, but this is what I did was I got a copy of my great uncle's death record. And again, he was actually died in 1923 at the age of 24. And again, his father's Albert Monroe, and that was my grandmother's brother. Another topic is mortality schedules, an interesting one. They only accompanied the census for the years 1850 to 1880, but are not always available for all states. And it covered those who died in the year prior to the census. For example, the 1850 mortality schedule covers June 1st, 1849 to May 31st, 1850. And the mortality schedule for Indiana are available through Indiana, and that's the website for that particular schedule. And again, indications of what a mortality schedule looks like. And again, you can find them on Ancestry.com as well as Family Search. And again, it gives you an indication of the person, when they died, where they died, and the like. So again, it's an interesting piece of information for that time period. Another record is the funeral record in Lodge. And again, it gives you an indication of information relative to the funeral itself. And it talks about it again, the person, the date, place of death, and date of death. They also had a place of birth or age, father's name, mother's name, and they talk about nativity, which means a location. And they were born he was born in Pennsylvania. Also talks about the cause of death, sex, and again, it talks about graves and lots and the like. So it gives you quite a bit of information, as well as casket type. And again, make and style. So again, it gives you a whole host of information relative to that particular funeral. Now, these are examples of newspaper orbits and death notices. The one on my left here is Melissa Brothers. Again, she was the wife of George William Brothers. And again, it says she was born in Clementsport, Nova Scotia. So again, this particular bit of information, some of it I'm not sure about, but in terms of who gave it. But again, it gives you a little bit of information about her life and her history relative to that, where it's going to be held. The funeral home is going to be held at Martha's Vineyard Funeral Home on a Monday. Now, this one is a little harder to read. This is the one for in Roxbury for my grandfather, Dolan B. Yates. But again, this is just an announcement. Then this one here is another one for, I'm sorry, let me back up here. Again, for Emily Burgess. And again, it talks about, I didn't know anything about her, but what this tells me, she is a relative. One of the key people listed here is the one who I've been tracking down, my mother's uncle, and my great uncle, Count Burgess. Also found out about another individual, Harry Carter, who I was able to find more information about. The fact that calling is Friday, November 17th, and the funeral is going to be held on November 18th at the McGuire Funeral Home at 1 p.m. So again, one is an announcement, the other is actually the obituary itself. A few more. Now this one, the reason I did LeCount Burgess was he was the hardest one for me to find. I could not find his death record, so I only found it in funeral information. And again, it talks about on the left-hand side where he died, the Gallo Hospital, which no longer exists in Washington, D.C., who his parents are. This is my mother, Edith Yates Brothers. So again, it gives you information who his nephew are, Pearl E. Minor, that's another family named Minor. And it talks about the notice of funeral later arrangements made by the McGuire Funeral Home. And on the right-hand side, again, you get more information. In this case, after 12 noon Sunday, friends are invited to call at the funeral home, where the service will be held on Monday with interment at the Harmony Cemetery. I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Another obituary on the left-hand side from my cousin who just passed away this year, Adrian McClure. And again, it talks about, again, the funeral, the burial be held at the Blue Hill Cemetery in Braintree and the time. And again, this is a more current appearance of things, talks about where donations can be made. And again, this is to the Massachusetts SPCA. On the right-hand side is my grandmother, Martha Monroe Brothers. And again, an awful lot of information. She passed away at 90. She was involved in a whole host of church clubs. So again, if you have any information about, for example, St. Mark's Congregational Church, there'll be information about the clubs that she belonged to. One of the key things was she headed up the state. She was actually president of the State Association of War Mothers, the entire state, in the 40s, because she had so many sons who were involved in that particular conflict. And again, you saw the Emily Burgess. This one here is Elmer E. Burgess, and this is my grandmother's brother. And again, it shows again the information relative to the survivors, where the funeral home is going to be held. Remember, he had cousins in Washington, D.C., and a host of friends in Brunswick, Maryland, where he last lived. And again, it talks about the church, the Brunswick Baptist Church, and Reverend Brooke of that church. And he is going to be also buried, which I found out later on, again, a Harmony ceremony, a Harmony Cemetery. And an interesting thing on this one, it asks the Brunswick, Maryland papers to please copy this particular obituary and publish it as well. Now, this is we talk about the fan club, friends, associates, and neighbors. This was my great uncle, Count LeBurge's landlord. I was able to track him in terms of where he lived, and Hattie Elizabeth Butler was the landlord. Her husband had passed away in the 40s itself, but it gives information about her. On the right-hand side, it talks about, again, the general announcement. And on the left-hand side, it talks about the funeral arrangements in the obituary itself. And again, interment at the Harmony Memorial Park Cemetery. Now, this one here, I apologize. This one is a little harder to read, but again, this is a layout of the Littleton, Massachusetts family plots. Who's buried where? So again, we talk about burial locations. Plots are a big time in terms of understanding who is buried where and who are some of your other relatives. Now, this is Mary Washington Brothers. She was born in Massachusetts and died in Massachusetts. But again, as a picture of her in information, again, a short synopsis of a sheet of deaths for that particular time period. Now, you have the cemetery name, if you're able to do that. Now what? Well, you can look at online databases, historic maps, county histories, and newspaper articles and deeds relative to that cemetery to verify that that's where it's located. Now, this is an example of a burial plot, and this is a lot easier to read, and this is the one in Groton. And again, where my grandmother and grandfather are buried, Lewis Brothers and Martha Brothers, and her mother and father, in this case, Helen Monroe, Albert C. Monroe, and Albert D. Monroe, father and son. And again, the bottom part shows the layout itself. And having talked to the sexton, out of this family burial plot, there was only one plot left. Now, this is an example of an actual cemetery layout. This is the Harmony Memorial Park in Maryland. And again, I've highlighted in various points where some of my relatives are buried. So again, I'm able to, again, identify where they're buried at a particular location. My sister has visited this particular cemetery. I have not. In this cemetery, my grandmother is buried. But again, she's buried in an unmarked grave. but she was able, my sister was able to find it based upon other markers. And let me show you what I mean. And again, you have grave number discs, you have lot number discs and the like, and these can point to where people are buried. And again, there are a fair number of unmarked graves. We talk about African-American churches with burial grounds, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. Again, this is a church in Virginia that we visited, and that's my cousin from Massachusetts. And you can look at the layout. This is right beside the church itself. So this is a church graveyard, an African-American church graveyard. And notice the stone tops. And again, a different format in terms of names and locations are evident here. So it's not an actual vertical tombstone, it's a horizontal tombstone. Now here's the question. Now, what is the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery? Well, obviously the graveyard adjoins a church, where a cemetery does not. And a graveyard is a part of the church that was used for burial. But as the population of Europe started to grow, but again, it was impossible to fit all the people in graveyards. Therefore, new sites were created that weren't attached to churches, and these new burial sites are called cemeteries. So again, that tradition was carried over to the United States when people came here as well. Now, what are the different types of cemetery records? And they vary from church actual burial registers, which we'll talk about. And again, if there's a burial location right beside the church, they'll have that. The sexton's records. The sexton is a person who really rides herd over church. Cemetery deed and plot registers. Burial permit records. Sometimes, again, some locations require a permit for a burial. Grave opening orders. Again, sometimes people are actually moved from one location to another. And again, they need the grave opening order to do so. Monument or gravestone inscriptions also help give you some information. And the records that we mentioned above can be used to verify the birth and death information, as well as other resource information. But remember, they can be incorrect. It depends upon who provided the information. This one, I like types of cemeteries. National, again, you tend to think of national cemeteries as being national military cemeteries, state cemeteries, county cemeteries, town cemeteries. There's specific military cemeteries on military bases, for example. Religious cemeteries, racial cemeteries, and I'll talk a little more about that. Private cemeteries and family cemeteries. Well, here in Allen County, Indiana, you'll see private and family cemeteries interspersed around the area here, because this was a great farming location, and many people were actually buried on the old family farm. When we talk about cemetery and graveyard research, again, we talk about a category, African-American cemeteries, and again, trying to find records and locations of them. And also, when you talk about situations in the cemeteries, African-American cemetery tends to be of one ethnic group, but other cemeteries, for example, a town cemetery, may have groups segregated in one location in that cemetery, again, either for African-Americans or others. Also, there are family records associated with cemeteries, death certificates, plot listings that I showed you, and a family plot layout. And unusual cemeteries. Now, I talk about this because of New Orleans is an example. Again, early on, most cemeteries had people buried underground. But I hadn't worked too good in New Orleans because of the flooding. And again, many of those, in this case, caskets floated up. And so they were now buried above ground rather than below ground. Now, on the lower left, it talks about a particular situation for Harmony. Harmony Cemetery moved to DC from Maryland. That's where my family members are buried. Another situation that I was involved with when I was on the Board of Trustees for the Indiana United Methodist Church, the airport asked that we move a cemetery right outside of its location in Indianapolis. And as the Board of Trustees approved it after contacting all of the family members. So again, the state paid for it, paid for the reburial, everything else. But the catch is you'll have to go into, again, the records in years to come to find out where a family member is now buried. Because if you remember, the original death certificate may give that cemetery at a different location than where it is right now. When I talk about cemetery segregation or separate areas. For example, in Lindenwood here, which is here in Fort Wayne, there's a section for Masonic burials. Other places, there are sections for Chinese people. There are also cemeteries for particular faith groups. Whether it be there's a Jewish cemetery here. There's also a Catholic cemetery here. So there are many different kinds of cemeteries. But a key thing in terms of churches are really take a look at the graveyard records associated with that church. And this is a carryover from England and Europe itself, where the churches themselves had birth, marriage, and death records that they maintained on their parishioners. Now, how to find cemeteries? Well, there's a geographical survey map of the area, and it'll provide information. Google cemeteries in the area for the city and county and the like. Google will provide it to you. And also relocated church burial grounds and cemeteries are also hard to find, but they can be found, again, with local records as well as state records. Now, this is a guide to the Massachusetts cemeteries. So again, it's a whole listing of cemeteries specifically in Massachusetts, and it gives location, when it started, how many people are buried there, and the like. And as a matter of fact, its location and what group actually started that cemetery. Now, searching in cemeteries. Many folks really enjoy doing that. And one of the key things is really walk around it or drive around it as a whole to get a feel of the place itself. And notice which sections of the cemetery look really old, again, the earliest burials, or contain mausoleums, again, very, very special locations. Look for larger monuments, which can indicate prominent citizens that were buried in that location. And a cemetery as a whole can say a lot about the ethnic groups that were in the area, also lifestyles, historical events that occurred in the area, and how the poor, affluent, the residents were. When I talk about historical events, what I'm talking about, for example, a military cemetery, or one in which a whole lot of folks who passed away at a particular period of time are buried. For example, a smallpox epidemic. Some people were actually buried in the same plot together. They were identified, but buried in that particular plot. Now, how do we find an ancestor's grave? Well, there are a couple of ways of doing that. Again, billion graves, find a grave is a neat way to do it. I do want to point out that Ancestry.com and in this case, Family Search also may provide information to help you out. This was a key question that I went through as I looked at cemetery information. Here's a question. Do you own your cemetery plot forever? Interesting. Here in the US, when you purchase a plot, it doesn't expire. The cemetery retains ownership of the land, but you purchase the right to use the land for a burial in perpetuity. But not all countries have the same right of plot ownership. Where in those countries, the final resting places may recycle plots after a period of 5 to 25 years, for example, in Germany, 90 years, for example, in Australia. What happens is the casket is not dug up, but the grave is deep enough where other caskets can be placed on top. So the location is reserved, the casket is still there, but the name or the stone on top no longer reflects the person buried in it. On tombstone research, now what can a stone tell me about my ancestors or their community? I like the cemetery. This was a cemetery in Virginia when I went to my wife's family reunion. And again, look around the cemetery. Look at the names, because it gives you an indication of the people who are perhaps neighbors or friends of your family members. Look at the others. I've always found tombstones interesting in terms of what they look like and what was on it. They come in different shapes, sizes, and with different symbols. I'll just show each one of them a little different. And I'll be teaching a course, hopefully next year, talking about cemetery symbology. What does it mean? And again, there's the state of Indiana provides a website which lists the most typical symbols found in cemeteries in Indiana. This is not always true for other states. Again, you can see the shape and form. A book talking about a life. And the book reflects the life of that individual. And again, there's a lamb in there. So again, this is a very, very old one, and reflects the image of our Lord Jesus Christ. And that was the image that was used on that gravestone. Some have information and also pictures. So again, that's another way of finding information about an individual, the information you may not have. And another, this case indicates that the individual was a veteran, served in the service. This one talks about, again, more of an ethnic background. When you take a look at the clothing, it gives you insights in terms of who that person was relative to how they dressed. Now, this is an interesting one for me because it has a Masonic symbol on it. Again, and that is the Mason, a symbol of U.S. Masonry. And again, the chain indicates connection. Now, this is my wife's grandmother and her husband, Cora Perry Gould, and William H. Perry. William died, and then Cora remarried, but she was buried with her first husband. This one is a Drastus Hazard. Now, this one is down in Beaufort, South Carolina. He was a member of the 54th, Massachusetts. And again, he was injured in the spring of 1865 and died in the summer of 65. So again, he's the only member of my family who served in the Civil War who was actually killed. So again, this is the indication of the National Cemetery or a monument in the National Cemetery in Beaufort, South Carolina. Now, this is indication of a family-made cross and remembrance. Michelle Brothers, again, was my cousin. She died at 12 months old. They didn't put a actual funeral stone. They put a cross with her name and the like on it. Now, this was an interesting one for me, just showing you something that's very, very different. Again, I never expected to find a tombstone with a parking standard beside it. And it talks about, on one side, that again, when they were born and when they died. So again, it's a very, very different type of tombstone, but it does reflect the life of the person that is buried there. And again, we talk about a new way of burials, in this case, cremations, in a mortuary where in Fort Wayne where people are buried. So again, there are a whole host of funeral urns with cremation remains in it. This is just an example of a mausoleum here in Fort Wayne. And again, it reflects the wealth and lifestyle of the people involved. We talk about tombstones, and mention, okay, what are some of the indications of what a tombstone looks like? Well, this is one for again, my cousin, Horace A. Hazard, who served in World War I. And again, they've asked for a tombstone for him because he died in 1941. He was in the infantry and he was a private. But again, and he's buried in Mount Hope Cemetery, where a whole host of my other family members are buried in Boston. Now, this is a request by the funeral home for a granite stone from Fadolin Buckman Yates, my grandfather. And again, that was done. And again, you see below it, it's Irene Jones, Irene J., who is his second wife and my mother's stepmother. But again, this is a great testimony to say, what is it? What is the cost? And in that time period, when was it ordered? Okay, where did my father live? Because my father was part of it, and my mother was the one who signed it. Part meaning he helped my mother, order it as far as that goes. So it gives you an indication of, again, what the stone actually looks like, and it does look like that. Now, funeral home research is an interesting one because funeral homes have not been around as long as you think they are. But what can they tell you? Let's first take a look at funeral home history. Now, a funeral home is relatively new. Prior to the funeral home, family members prepared their family members for burial and buried them. And mostly women who did that, not men. Men were the ones who organized, dug the grave, got the casket and the like. And the term in this time frame was a family parlor. The parlor was used for viewing and perhaps the funeral ceremony in a house. So again, as we think of in a funeral home, a funeral parlor, that's where the term came from. Now, around 1850 and thereafter, the Civil War introduced embalming to allow transportation of fallen soldiers to their home. And local morticians continued that practice. Military morticians did it in the Civil War and conducted the funeral at their respective location of business. So again, this is the genesis of the funeral home itself. Now, interesting facts. Funeral makers made caskets and later also became involved in developing funeral homes. And I would point out that caskets could be purchased at the local town store. So again, it's an interesting situation. I keep thinking of the Western movies, the cowboy movies, and I always remember, I can't remember the name of the movie, but the casket maker, again, would keep looking at people, size them up and say, what size casket do I need to make them? And of course, this was the time of the shootouts of the OK Corral. Now, what kind of funeral home records are available? Number one, they're usually kept by the local funeral home itself. And if a funeral home closes, they could be donated to the local library or archive, kept by the owners, or discarded. I do want to point out sometimes they're actually returned to the state itself, and the state maintains a record. Those records also contain information about the burial, but often about close relatives of the deceased as well. I want to show you in terms of funeral transportation. We're talking about, a situation in the 1800s of horse-drawn carriages. On the right is in this case, a motorized vehicle with a African-American funeral director. Again, later on, you ended up with a more of a sedan-looking hearse. The center is the funeral car for Abraham Lincoln. The right is a indication of one possibility in terms of horse-drawn capabilities. But I want to point out that for our ancestors early on, the horse-drawn buckboard wagon may be the way the casket itself was carried from the house to perhaps a church and then to the cemetery itself for burial. Now, this is an example of the African-American funeral experience. And again, the African-Americans at the church headed to a church burial ground. Now, what are the responsibilities of a funeral home? They purchase a coffin. They transport the deceased. I'll come back at that for a second. They purchase the tombstone itself. They record the copies of death records. Quite often they help in preparing or prepare the obituary announcement. They set up both the visitation and funeral service. They do have arrangements and acknowledgement of a military service at the funeral or on the tombstone itself. And again, there are two types. There can be a full military funeral in which the funeral director helps, again, prepare the deceased and participate in, or again, there can be a color guard at a funeral with a flag ceremony to present the flag to the widow of a fallen soldier. They also set up the burial or cremation service and do that, and they do much more. Now, what do the funeral records themselves provide? Birth and death date and place, the most recent residence, occupation information, military details, name of the spouse, and the date of death and marriage date, listing of surviving and deceased children and siblings and their residences, the number of grandchildren, the name of the parents, funeral service and visitation details, actual funeral details and burial details themselves, and transportation details if the deceased was being transported to or from elsewhere. My grandmother, Irene Burgess Brothers, who died in Boston, was transported by train to Washington, D.C. to be buried in the D.C. area. Today, you'll hear about people being transported or their coffins being transported on an airplane, on a train, or on other kind of vehicle as far as that goes. So there are many modes of transportation as far as that goes. I want to thank Melissa Tennant. Again, her particular handout provided this information, but get a chance to take a look at on YouTube to her particular presentation on death business, searching funeral home collections. One of the key facets that a funeral home or a church may provide is what I call a funeral brochure. And this is for my uncle, Kenneth Brothers, who was born in 1913 and died in 2007. He was held in Roxbury, Massachusetts at St. Mark Congregationalist Church. And again, when it occurred, the viewing of the service itself on January 12th, the officiating pastor, Reverend Carl Thompson. The insert has on the left-hand side is information about Uncle Ken, what he was involved in. And the right-hand side talks about the order of service. And it also lists his internment at the Massachusetts National Cemetery in Bourne, Massachusetts. Other members of my military family, on my father's side, are also interned there. Also gives you information about what he did in life. He's a professional photographer, and he was the one who got me involved in photography. So again, it lists all kinds of information about him and his involvement with St. Mark Church and others. Now, this is just the outside of the homecoming service for my grandmother, Martha Lawrence Brothers. And again, in 1989, when it occurred, where it occurred, her interment was at the Groton Cemetery that I showed you, and the funeral director was Marjorie Johnson. And again, our family has used that funeral home for quite a while. Now, this is the one talking about the life of my mother, Edith Brothers. She was born in 24, died in 2018. The service was held at the 12th Baptist Church. And again, it talks about, an expression of thanks to, again, she spent a good number of years living at a assisted living location in Chicago. She's going to be interned. She was interned at the National Military Cemetery in Bourne with my dad. My dad passed away first. So it talks about the funeral homes that were involved. The one in Chicago, because she died in Chicago, was the one who did the preparation. And the George Lopes Funeral Home was the one that actually performed the burial itself. So again, there's quite a bit of information on something like this. Now, my grandfather, Dolan Buckman Yates, was the organist at St. Mark's Congregational Church for many, many years. Again, he also was an outstanding musician. So the church itself had a memorial service for him. And again, this was held on June 4th, 1944 at St. Mark's Congregational Church. And Reverend S.L. Lavenscount was the pastor, and he was my pastor early on as a young man. And again, inside is the program itself, organist, an appreciation, unveiling. There was a window that was actually a stained glass window that was presented and put in the church in honor of my grandfather. And again, there's a wreath on the window. The key thing is many of the names. When you look at that, people I knew very, very well in terms of the Youngbloods, the Colemans, and the Lavenscounts. So again, there's quite a bit of information on something like this. There's another thing called the funeral register. And again, it registers the folks opt to sign in when they attend the viewing and or the funeral itself. And again, on the beginning of it, it talks about who it is, state of birth, date of death, his age, and again, where the service was conducted, by whom, and who the pallbearers were. And again, they were a close friend of his. And then further on, you'll see it, as in most cases, who called. And again, this one gives us, in many cases, the name and address of people. Most interesting I found as I went through the collection, a number of people he worked for the post office, from the post office came again to the viewing and or the funeral itself. So again, it gives you much more information about people. And these folks, based upon the address, he lived on Harrishaw Street, Hollander Street, and others were immediately right around, so you recognize who some of the immediate neighbors are. So in summary, again, cemetery research is a neat way of getting to know your ancestor and his or her burial information. Again, it provides a wealth of information through data and information and resources. Tombstone research also backs that up. You know where they're buried physically in the cemetery itself, and quite a bit of information on the tombstone can lead you to other information. I've seen information on both the front and back of a tombstone, again, providing quite a bit of family information and genealogy information. And funeral home research is a neat way to, again, capitalize on information that the funeral home may have, yet the funeral home is still in existence. And again, it can provide a wealth of information relative to the family and friends your deceased family member had in the time frame that they lived. I do want to point out a great bit of information. The Indian Department of Natural Resources, again, maintains quite a bit of information on cemeteries and burial grounds in Indiana. So again, when you think about it, think about the state that you're investigating, and they may have something very, very similar. And this is the information relative to it. It's Indianapolis. And again, it's part of the Department of Natural Resources. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions if I can.
Thank you, Dr. Brothers. I'm looking in the chat, and Aaron asked a question, but
Okay.
I'm not exactly sure. Aaron, could you elaborate on your question? You say, would you get this from a funeral home?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
Hey, how's this one doing? I'm trying to think of, oh, Saluna, please. I'm trying to think of where we were, what you had on the screen when I asked. I think because I've been doing some research. So I have some ancestors that came to Fort Wayne from Paulding, Ohio, and so
Okay.
so some of them are buried there, some of them are buried in Fort Wayne, and then some of them like died in Fort Wayne and then were transported back to Paulding to be buried. But then some of them, like, I can't find headstones, like, like that kind of. This is like turn of the century, like early 1900s. So I think it was, gosh, what were you? You had something on the screen, and it was like, oh, I can't think of what it was, but it was something. I guess it was like the ledger. It was like the funeral ledger. Maybe that's what it was. The thing that you said had information about the actual funeral, because that's something I haven't seen. I have like the death record, and and like the death certificate says that she was interned in Fort Wayne. I think at Peltier or Perrier or whatever that funeral home was. But I haven't been able to find any information there. And then she's supposedly buried in Paulding, Ohio somewhere, but there's no headstone. So I'm like, wow, maybe if I find the funeral ledger, I'll have more information. But I didn't know where would I get that from, the funeral home in Paulding or in Fort Wayne or that kind of thing.
The thing you might want to look for would be the funeral brochure itself, or the obituary. Her obituary can also mention who the funeral home was, because again, there may be one here and one in Paulding. The one here talks about who participated, as a funeral home and funeral director here in Fort Wayne, but also who provide the burial services, as I mentioned, for my grandmother in DC and in Paulding itself, and then you can work from there. And it may also indicate the cemetery that she's buried in. And if you can find out the cemetery, you may be able to get a hold of cemetery records. I know that's what I've done here in Fort Wayne and other places. I've actually gone to the cemetery office and asked, can you help me? And they sure have. They've opened up their records and provided this is who it was, where they're buried, who's buried beside them and everything else. So quite often they're more than willing to help you out. So again, those are ways. The other way is to talk to your local historical society or library to get more information about the cemetery.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And Dr. Brothers, Shelley Murphy actually has more of a comment. She says, Gould, Gould, is a family name on her tree.
Okay.
And Shelley, would you like to,
It's just one of them way back European names, actually, Dr. Brothers. So we might want to check that out. Gould is Gould.
Yes.
I made another comment also, so thanks for that. I think some of the funeral homes I've been accessing been holding out information because you showing a little more than normally, I've been receiving. So I'm just wondering if I need to ask for ask it a different way rather than, just what record do you have for, this person? And I can get the burial records on the military, find them, but that funeral home and the one in Fort Wayne, probably is the one I'm going to ask. That Lindenwood, Lindenwood.
Yep.
And because I have some 3 folks buried in there and up in the Negro section. So I'm
Right.
just wondering if there's a little more info that might be available.
There may be records here at the Allen County Public Library relative to that.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that's one way. But also, quite often, I found out, even when I went to a cemetery just to take a picture of a stone again. In one cemetery, it says, "You're not familiar graves or find a grave." We don't like to do that. I said, "I'm only here for this one." I showed him what it was. He gave me all the information, location, the whole 9 yards. So again, it depends upon how you approach them as far as that goes, quite honestly.
Yeah.
I do my darndest to be interested in them as well and the cemetery.
Well, and from when I was there, this was several years ago, there's actually just that little plug thing in the ground. So I need to see if I can't find some type of, memorial or a headstone to put on the grave.
Sure.
Also, because it's up in that old section.
Okay.
Because he died in 1928. That was the first one buried in there.
Okay.
So I want to get some type of a little headstone or something there.
As I say, you might want to look at the obituary records here in Fort Wayne.
Yeah.
There were 3 newspapers here at that time. So again, one of them might very well be able to
Okay.
provide information. And also
Great.
check and see what records are here, literally at the library, because it's interesting in terms of what records physically show up here, as far as that goes.
Actually, the library is where I did find the info that he was buried in that cemetery and then got in a cab and went, and went there. Yeah. Yeah. And that was, I think, the first time coming into Fort Wayne several years ago.
Okay.
So I appreciate that.
Question: did you ever find out, which funeral home did the service?
You know what? I don't know, but I'm getting ready to check.
2 things: the funeral home, and if the funeral was actually conducted at a church. Those are the 2 I try to check out.
Okay. Let me see if it says it on the death record. It just gives Lindenwood, and the burial was March 5th. And the undertaker is it Michelo?
Oh, yeah. Michelle. Yeah, Michelle. Yeah.
Michelle?
Yeah.
And I don't see anything about funeral home. Let me see if he's obit.
Yeah, the obit might be the one that tells you. The one I showed you, in many cases,
Yeah,
talks
the
about the church.
obit says member of Mount Olive Church, American Woodman. And nope, it doesn't say. Just says age, Govan Curitan, age 63, colored.
Yep.
Died at 11/16 this morning at his home, 529 Holman, after 2 months of illness of pneumonia. Came to Fort Wayne, 1917. Yeah, no funeral home. So maybe I can get that and I'll check on that. Because then I could see, because when I went to Lindenwood, again, I thought all I had was the obit, the death certificate. And then I found, the obit, the little obit in the newspaper.
The other thing I might check is I'm not that familiar with Fort Wayne or Allen County. I am familiar again with places in Massachusetts. They, in fact, the towns in Massachusetts, some of the cities that also kept an annual record of who passed away, and kept records, and the records talk about where they were buried, the whole 9 yards, who the funeral home was. So again, it depends upon it. So the other thing you might hit is the historical society here,
Yeah.
because
All
that's
right, Adrian.
because that's what I did. That's what I did in Groton, Mass. I went to the historical society and they grabbed the record. Come on here, come in. Let me show you what the records that we have. So it provides me more information, and it's interesting because they also provided me with the name of the sexton, and again because I couldn't find my grandmother and grandfather's grave as I try to walk, the cemetery, and so they gave me the sexton's name. She called me the next day and said, "Come on down, I'll show you where it is." Went down and she says they're buried right next to my family. She was not African American, but in that situation.
That's awesome.
But she also gave information about some of my relatives who served in the Civil War, and one of the monuments in Groton that was for a drastic hazard. So again, it depends upon the relationship that you set up with some of these folks, to be honest about it. And that's the key in any business.
And I'll be nice.
I know you're nice. And I saw the other comment about, the one in Ohio who didn't want to give you the time of day. My recommendation would go to the Historical Society.
Yeah, definitely.
Because that is a way, because there may be a connection between the two where the Historical Society can get you the records.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Shelley. We also have a comment from Lisa Ridley, who's trying to get information from a funeral home in Ohio that's not trying to give her information. Lisa, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think when hi, Dr. Brothers.
How you doing?
Okay, I think when I called them, I was hopeful that I was going to get the information that I needed, and I didn't really know exactly how to approach each other. Just to say, I'm looking for obituary information on my grandfather, which ended up he died in like the 1990s.
Okay.
So I was like, oh, they will have this information. And they were like, no, I don't know if she didn't want to look it up. Then I thought, well, maybe they purged that data some kind of way. And so I just didn't get what I wanted to get from them. But now I think since I know a little bit more of an avenue of where I can just say, hey, can you just provide this, or, know how they get their data or where they keep their stuff. So then I can come at them a different way.
And the other thing is actually ask the library. Again, the library, in terms of obituary records, and many libraries do and have that kind of information. I know I did research for a fellow who contacted me, and I contacted the library in the town in which his grandfather died. And I was able to get information on how he died, when he died, the whole 9 yards, the newspaper articles, the whole bit. So again, the libraries quite often, the historical societies quite often are neat resources.
Yeah. And I did want to speak to, I think, Shelley Murphy. I think that was, no, that wasn't Shelley. That wasn't Shelley. That was Erin Bevel. Regarding that Paulding, Ohio. I recently found some of my nieces that have a relationship or family in Paulding, Ohio. And they actually went to the grave site, and she said everybody that was in the graveyard was related. So I don't know if that was a private graveyard or family graveyard, but it seemed like everybody there they were related to. So Paulding, Ohio, I didn't realize that they had a lot of African Americans there, and they do.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
They do.
Yes.
And so when the family members brought that back to me, and I'm like, I'm just, for now, within this last year, all I hear is Paulding, Ohio. So just wanted to say that I think they do have private cemeteries or maybe family cemeteries.
They can, sure. Oh, yeah. Well, the other thing to remember, as I showed you my family plots, sometimes the family burial grounds are very, very large in the cemetery itself.
Yeah. So I just want to say thank you for this information. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, but I did post the handout in the chat. I want to make sure one saw that. If you were not able to download it, please put your email in the chat and I will personally email that to you. If you are not a member of the society, please put your email in the chat and we can put you on our monthly email list. And Dr. Brothers, I think you've got some information about some upcoming presentations.
Yes, I do want to mention two particularly. Again, this Saturday, October 23rd, we have Tim Pinnock, again, a great guy who's helped us out before. His topic is going to be using scholars to evaluate African-American research success, actually to help provide that kind of success. It's going to be on Zoom, October 23rd at 1 p.m. And then let's see, Eunice Trotter will be joining us on November 17th at 6 p.m. So I want to say that we're looking forward to hear from Eunice as well. Again, it's a chance for us to get other people involved and a new way for us to learn as well.
And let me add, Dr. Brothers, that Eunice Trotter just published a book called Black in Indiana. And these are stories about information about African Americans in early, I'm not sure of the year, but early African Americans here in Indiana, some stories that we don't even know about.
That's great. And I'm looking forward to it because every place I go, it's interesting to find out about the history of our people in that area, how they got there, what they're involved with, and the like. And it's an amazing story of our African-American heritage. So any other questions? Oh, and again, I want to say hi to Roberta. Again, she joined me here at the library. The library, remember, your libraries are fantastic resources, and also as well as other things as well. Please use them as well. I know Shelley knows that very, very well. But please, again, join us next time. Again, we'll be the third Saturday of every month. We'll have a workshop of some sort. So please look forward to hearing from us. So I want to say thank you very much for joining us.
And also, you can find more information about our upcoming presentations on our Facebook page. Just search AAGSFW, African American Genealogical Society of Fort Wayne. And if you're interested in becoming a member, we'd love to have you.
I want to thank everyone for participating in today's Zoom and the training class presented by our esteemed and highly appreciated Dr. Alfred Brothers. I have been attending silently today, and I encourage you that if you have any questions, as has already been stated, please submit it to us via the chat, or you can always go on Facebook and let us know that you have questions or concerns. I think that we're very blessed to have an accomplished researcher such as Dr. Brothers and the many other members of our growing popular genealogical society. Join us, get your story out there, speak for your ancestors, give them the voice that they were denied by simply doing the research and letting us know they were here. Thank you so much, everyone.